first, last night's budget confirms that Anthony Albanese is running the most Green left government we've ever had. More handouts, more debt and more picking winners. So much the Prime Minister's pre-election pledge that he represented safe change. On top of the epic incompetence in migration and border protection, those workplace changes to buy off the unions, the failed attempt to entrench racial difference in our constitution via the voice, and broken promises on tax and superannuation, well, now gone is any pretence of budget responsibility. With terms of trade at a once-in-a-century high and with unemployment at a once-in-half-a-century low, the budget now should be in massive surplus. Instead, there's a wafer-thin $9 billion surplus, largely on the back of fossil fuel exports that the government wants to stop. To be followed then by a long run of deficits between 1% and 2% of GDP, based on baked-in spending, some $315 billion on the so-called care economy. Plus, there's $80 billion in off-budget spending, student loans, low-income housing, more green projects, and another $7 billion on that boondoggle, the snowy hydro 2.0. But even with so much spending off budget, net debt, well, it's still expected to grow by another $200 billion over the next 5 years. All the old budget rules, such as keeping tax under a certain percentage of GDP, capping growth in spending, and insisting that any new spending is offset by savings that helped Peter Costello deliver 10 straight budget surpluses. Paul Keating too. He got there with those rules to force surpluses. Well, they've now been scrapped in favour of the creative accounting that Labor dresses up spending as investment.
Investing in a future made in Australia and expanding business investment. We're also investing $6.2 billion in new investments. We're investing in vital projects to investment in our economy, focusing investment to lift private investment. We will create a front door for investors that adds discipline to investments in the national interest and streamline approvals across environmental, planning, cultural heritage and foreign investment.
It's spending, not investment. That's just treasurer's spin. What this budget conclusively proves is that Labor has monumentally failed to grasp that a government can't spend a dollar that it doesn't get from taxpayers, either as taxes now or taxes tomorrow, to pay for today's debt. As always, Labor thinks that government's much smarter at spending your money better than you are. All the average Australian will gain from this budget that's new is the non-means tested $300 electricity handout that won't nearly compensate anyone for the spike in power costs. And for low-income renters, some extra help that won't nearly compensate them for the extra migration and the interest rate-driven rise in housing costs. Even then too, these are essentially the government putting money in one pocket that it's taken out of your other pocket. The only real surprise in the budget was the brazenness with which the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, abandoned any fidelity to the fiscally responsible pro-market legacy of Keating and Bob Hawke to trumpet the virtues of green interventionism. The relentless boosterism of Chalmers sits uneasily with the fact that Australians are struggling with their mortgage repayments that have doubled, and they don't feel the government has helped them in any way. As recent polls show, voters have well and truly noticed that GDP per person, well, that's fallen for 4 straight quarters, meaning that whatever the headline numbers might say, ordinary families, well, they're in a deep recession. Now, even if these handouts temporarily mask some of the policy-driven cost increases, well, struggling families are much more likely to spend on necessities than keep the money in their pocket. Hence the overall inflationary pressures that so worry the Reserve Bank and have led to the sustained rise in interest rates that might even increase again. The budget has only intensified the paradox of the Reserve Bank tapping the economic brakes while the government's pushing the accelerator. So much so that economists are now tipping more interest rate rises. It seems undeniable that the biggest impact of this budget will be keep rates higher for longer, with even the budget papers now forecasting there's no drop in the cash rate before the middle of next year. Now, don't forget, We were promised a rate cut by the middle of this year. Then it was pushed out to Christmas. And now Jim Chalmers says in his own budget papers, you will not get relief, if you get it at all, before well into next year.
2.75% inflation by Christmas, a Stephen Kennedy prediction or a Jim Chalmers prediction?
We don't sit in our office and write the forecasts. The Treasury team of very professional, very diligent people do that work.
As well, there's permanently higher wages for aged care workers and childcare workers. As I've said, fine. If they deserve an increase, they do, sure. But why are you as a taxpayer paying the wages of people in the private sector? There's been no serious attempt in this budget to rein in skyrocketing NDIS costs either. All they've done is stop the cost shifting from the states to the Commonwealth. It's still the one taxpayer footing the bill. And it's far from clear that the government's serious about big cuts to migration. Quite apart from the fact it needs continued high immigration to pump up the overall economic growth numbers and to avoid a technical recession. And even on its own figures, it still expects to keep immigration at double the average of the Howard years. There's still as yet no specificity about how it'll cap overseas student numbers or require those educational institutions to house the students they import. But this has become a characteristic of the Albanese government, to declare an objective without any detail about its implementation and then to act as though wishing it makes it happen. Now, given the woke obsessions of our universities, is the government's announced objective to graduate 8 out of 10 Australians by 2050, so 8 out of 10 of us have got to have a university degree, says Labor. Is that about making us more productive as opposed to creating more green left voters? Then there's some $23 billion in various Future Made in Australia programs, all designed to make us a renewable energy superpower because the Treasurer insists the world's committed to net zero. Well, they're not. China and India are not, or at least not as quickly or as convulsively as here in Australia. It doesn't matter how often the government asserts it. The notion that Australia has a comparative advantage here, as if other countries don't have wind or sunlight, well, it hardly stands up to scrutiny. There may be a case for some assistance to the strategic minerals area that we need for battery making, especially given China's attempt to corner this market. But it's hard to credit that we should invest in green hydrogen that's completely unproven at scale, or that we can somehow out-subsidise the US or the EU. Now, given that many of the big players in this area are billionaires such as Twiggy Forrest, why is the government relieving them of the need to commit more of their own money? Why is Labor bankrolling billionaires but making ordinary families scrimp and save? It's now a decade since the last budget that attempted serious economic reform, when the coalition tried to roll back entitlements and rein in some of this government spending. But with no obvious cuts to anything last night and an abundance of giveaways, this budget has all the feel of a pre-election budget, something the Treasurer today refused to rule out.
Is it an interest rate cut? Is it an election victory? Because those budget papers have election written all over them.
A lot of you have asked me, is this the last budget of the parliamentary term? My answer to that is I'm expecting to do another one, but that's in the hands of Prime Ministers.
Weasel words. Perhaps backed with more wall-to-wall government advertising, these budget handouts might be enough to anaesthetise voters. But if the government does run to a premature election before the end of next year or before it does another full budget, it will expose its fear that the overall economy is just going to get worse.